Well, good morning from here in London, and I daren't think what time it might be, some 200 kilometers south of Sydney. But we're delighted that Brett Feldon is dialing in with his colleague, Isabelle Muller, who's here in the UK. And we're going to have a good discussion this morning about biometrics, how to create digital identities right the first time. Clearly, this is an important topic within financial services, but actually it's been of increasing importance in all sorts of other areas, whether it's health, anti-fraud, cyber, what have you, and possibly, as we've seen with COVID-19, transportation, or even just the right to go and see a film. So let's have a look at some of this this morning. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors of Zien. And it is a privilege to be able to introduce these webinars on such varied and fascinating subjects. And I can only do so thanks to the tolerance and, dare I say it, the open-mindedness of our sponsors who allow us to range widely and freely across topics of our choosing that are relevant to technology, economics, and finance, you, the audience. Now, today's format will follow a fairly similar one to most, and that's that my job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from our experts. Isabelle and Brett have got quite a few slides, but they'll whip through them in under 20 minutes. And they have a couple of one poll here, which they'd like you to answer. So do be ready there with your fingers on the buzzers. And then on to housekeeping quickly. Yes, the slides are available. In fact, they're already posted on the site. Secondly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up in approximately 2 working days, so certainly by about midday on Thursday at the latest. And thirdly, yes, we do welcome questions. Please do use the GoToWebinar facility to put in questions, observations, comments, and I will feed them into the conversation during the last 20 minutes of the webinar. Please do use that facility because I'm here with you, and I'm not on Signal and email and all the other things, so I'll only get those messages too late. Every comment, question, or observation you send in will be sent on to Brett and Isabelle. So if there's a point of detail or you'd like them to validate something, just send it in and they will get everything and they can answer it over the coming days. So with no more ado, if I may, I'd like to hand the floor over to Isabelle and Brett.
Thank you, Michael. Next slide, please. Biometrics are certainly exciting. They're kind of cool, really, and very, very fast-paced, I think, as we all know, and they are constantly improving. But they can make the world a better place. As we all know, they can help to catch bad people. They can create social or financial inclusion. They create convenience, seamless transactions, and also higher levels of security when you think about passwords, for example. And the technology won't go away, and we don't want to stop innovation. But what we can influence, of course, is how we are using this technology and ensure that the technology serves us rather than exploits us. And if our future is built on intelligent machines, then of course biometrics will be one of those legs that this will be built on. But there are risks. And so with that, let me turn to Brett. Brett, could you give us some examples there of what uses we are seeing for biometrics in financial services, and also share with us how you feel about those use cases? I mean, are there potential risks and where are those touch points?
Sure. So on screen is a non-exhaustive summary that we prepared for this conversation, just talking a little bit about some of the ways and places that biometrics intersect with financial services, really just as a bit of a scene setter. All a bit complicated, as you can see there, but if you think through a couple of examples, at the bottom and the middle of the screen there, the classical example of making a payment using a mobile device. And quite commonly, that payment is controlled or is authenticated on device by the user using some kind of biometric mechanism on the device to verify their identity, which causes the payment to be permitted. Similarly, on device, you might have a mobile app that's depicted just above that in the center of the screen to allow access to some kind of banking facilities, account balances, transfers, that kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing about both those cases is they use biometrics supplied ultimately by a third party, that is, it's the on-device biometrics that are being used to verify identities. And that's got all sorts of interesting consequences. It could be perhaps that someone set up access for another person to their device, and so there might be multiple biometrics stored on the device. that allow access to some of those banking services, whether it's payments or whether it's apps or whatever. There's also, of course, the prospect there that there are multiple different biometrics involved, right? We might have different biometrics on different devices, all of which is to some extent a bit invisible and a bit opaque to the financial services institution. But that's not the only place biometrics might touch a financial services or a banking relationship. Quite a few banks, for instance, verify the identities of their account holders when they're seeking service, maybe say over the phone using voice biometrics. In that case, that will be controlled to a much tighter level by the bank themselves. They'd be the one holding information about the way their customers' voices sound, and that might be used to verify identity over the phone. Sometimes there are even interactions between ways that people converse with the bank or engage with the bank. So if you think about organizations that perhaps want to increase security of a transaction that's about to happen on the phone, they might then appeal to the app to say, give me a special passcode or some one-time code from the app, or perhaps dispatch a message to the app expecting the customer to do something with it. Of course, that then puts the app back into play and in the biometrics that it uses in order to mediate identities and control that authentication process. And then, of course, there are other parties again using biometrics to potentially validate the identity of a customer to use a pre-existing payment mechanism. An example of that that's been in the press a little bit recently is around Amazon, who you may know in the US with their specialist retail presences have been experimenting with using palm recognition in store in order to verify your identity as an Amazon customer, that then allowing you to use the pre-existing payment method you've set up. And there are other examples and other potential biometrics that could be used there. So the end result of all of this is we've got this quite complex picture of different ways that people touch authentication and different ways that people touch biometrics. And all of them sort of intersect a bit untidily with this idea of digital identity, which is very difficult to define consistently. There are a number of different ways that people can, go about the process of defining digital identities. But if you think about a simple one, the way I verify my identity online, or the way I verify my identity when performing a digital transaction, we've got lots of those. In this simple banking context, we've got, what, half a dozen depicted on the screen here. If you think more widely about your other relationships with other organizations, I've probably got hundreds of different ways that I verify my identity with various digital establishments, digital organizations. And so I think one of the real themes and one of the things that's underpinned a bit by biometrics is around how do we try to consolidate that a little bit? How do we try to do better at this world of digital identity, in particular underpinned by using biometrics to make it really, really solid? And so that then leads us to a question. If we could do better than where we are at the moment, if we could do better than having lots and lots of different digital identities, what would the right number be? And yes, please move on to the poll. That's absolutely fine. We're going to ask you a question here to see what your own perspective is on this. If you think about today's world, my example of having hundreds of digital identities liberally spread across the internet and all of these various digital presences, that's kind of one end of the spectrum. And there are probably people who want to stay there, who want to have just everything split up and separated out independently. There are some who'd want just one, right? You have a single digital identity, you use it everywhere. If you had the opportunity to do that, the opportunity to share digital identities and reuse them wherever you could, maybe you'd want just one. And there are probably people who want to just consolidate a little bit, but maybe don't trust having everything consolidated up into one. Maybe they want to have, say, a digital identity for really secure stuff like government and financial services, perhaps. Maybe one for less secure stuff, but ordinary and important stuff. Maybe, I don't know, online shopping, retail, their recipe website, and maybe one for really embarrassing stuff like I don't know, my membership of the Rick Astley fan club, for instance. And so that leads us to this question.
Yeah, and Brett, we've put that poll up there. And,
yes.
3/4 of the audience have voted now. I'm just going to
excellent.
One more second, and we're just going to close that and present the results back to you.
Excellent.
And here you are.
Well, would you look at that? Fascinating to see, and this is particularly interesting for those who work in digital identity and think about trying to create a single, say, government-sponsored digital identity, that actually it's only a very small sliver of the population who'd want a single digital identity. And it's probably worth Isabelle, you've got a few remarks to make here on the sorts of things that we ask our members, and we'll try to compare this with the perspective that we've got from some of our own members as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Brett. We'll come back to that in a moment. But I thought in the meantime, I also share some insights. Every year, the Biometrics Institute conducts an industry survey with its community members, stakeholders. It takes place in May, June every year. And I picked two attitude questions from that survey because they're relevant to the conversation here, where we ask them whether they agree or disagree. And the first question was whether biometrics will be a key enabler for anchoring digital identity. And you can see here that a clear majority, 53% and then 38%, said they agree that biometrics will play a key role. And equally strong was the agreement on the question that there will continue to be significant growth in remote identity verification systems and remote onboarding technology. So certainly a clear recognition that biometrics have a role to play in managing those digital identities. And so, Brett, I'll just hand back to you because we had just coming back on the poll. If we share the next slide, please.
Yeah, well, the interesting contrast here, of course, is the one digital identity piece. Of course, the two polls results that you see here, noting that there was 1% of people who said, no, I don't want any digital identities, which, that's a reasonable position to take, I suppose, but it makes it difficult to engage in the modern world. But the interesting thing is that when we surveyed our own community of industry specialists in biometrics in two different contexts, the Congress one is a mostly European and US audience. The ANZ member meeting is mostly Australasian, so a little bit of Asia, mostly Australian and New Zealand. But they were very consistent in their perspective, and you can see that the much higher rate of people suggesting they would want a single digital identity across all of their various engagements. Whereas, of course, the audience here today, it was 12% of people who said they wanted a single digital identity. So it's a very interesting contrast with the people who work in the biometrics community, what we've seen today, and possibly that reinforces perhaps this wider spread that we see in the community about different uses of digital identities, and perhaps people not being completely comfortable with consolidating everything up into a single unified identity just yet. And certainly there are many interesting and important questions around data security and privacy and what happens if something gets lost or stolen or misplaced or hacked. What are the consequences for that? And those are material issues that we think about here at the Institute as well.
So Brett, you didn't talk all that much yet around the onboarding of digital identity. And we've seen in that previous slide that obviously anchoring an identity for digital online use is critical. So what are some of those key considerations for digital onboarding?
Yeah, it's a big issue too. And in fact, when we first created this digital identity expertise group within the Institute, thinking about the onboarding process and the intersection of biometrics with onboarding digital identities was the very first piece of content we built, the very first piece of good practice guidance that we built. It's one of the things that we do here at the Institute is we develop best practice guidance for the use of biometrics in a range of different contexts. And we did that because we were conscious as a digital identity group, as a body of people working in the field, of some of the interesting, perhaps, implementation choices that people had made around uses of biometrics in creating new digital identities. And so we thought there was some useful guidance to be given. But I might step back for a second before that and just put this in a little bit of context. If I could have the next slide, please. We produce quite a wide range of different best practice material around the use of biometric technologies in a range of different contexts. And you can probably put your mind to where biometrics might get used across many different sectors of the economy. But one of the very, I guess, apex pieces of guidance is this one, this 3 laws of biometrics, obviously by analogy with Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And the really key thing here is the order. That is, so many biometrics projects start with technology and then work backwards to work out what problems are being solved and what policy should be in place. And that really leads you into big problems down the track with applications of technology that cause downstream issues with people's privacy and ways that data is used that just don't fit the use case correctly. And so we strongly advocate thinking much more clearly through what are you trying to achieve first before starting to apply the technology to the problem. And so I include this here only to make the point that there is a wide range of guidance on biometrics, this being one piece. This flows down into a number of other pieces of guidance around the use of biometrics. And what we're about to talk about with onboarding is kind of a specific, if you like, stripe, a specific segment of the use of biometrics. We could push on to the next slide, please. So for that part of the journey, that is creating a new digital identity, we have a specific best practice guide about how to do that. And I can't talk you through the whole thing here, it would take far too long, but I will call out a couple of key issues. The first point, of course, is the importance of biometrics in creating trusted digital identities. So if we set aside digital identity in the sense of my login to the Rick Astley fan club, where it doesn't really matter who it is who owns the login. It's not a materially important thing. It is, though, in a range of contexts. It is in government, usually, because it's very important to know who's getting benefit streams are paid by the government, who's paying what tax bills. And it's almost always important in financial services. The regulations around financial services and knowing one's customer are such that almost always when you create a new banking or a new financial services relationship, in a digital world, you're trying to attach that digital identity, that digital person, if you like, to a real person with some high level of confidence. And in that world, biometrics is one of the very few technologies that can help concretely solve that problem. And so biometrics is a critical part of this process. Some of the things we call out in this onboarding paper include the process that in digital identity terms is called binding. That's where we attach a real person to the digital identity, or I suppose you could argue the reverse, the digital identity to the real person. And there are a couple of key things that happen during that process. One of them is that as we think about the poll question we just asked you about the number of digital identities you'd want, is about reuse. If you don't have to create a new digital identity, if there's a way that you can use an existing identity, whether it's through some interoperability mechanism or some agreed reuse mechanism, then that's a really good way to avoid solving some of the problems that are needed with biometrics in an onboarding process. It has other challenges to solve around trust with the other party whose identities you're reusing, of course, but that's a really good way to avoid some of the challenges we're about to speak about. If you do have to create a new digital identity, and so you do have to bind the digital identity to a real person, then two of the key things that are worth thinking about are first, how do you make sure that the real person presents information about themselves? So a common onboarding process is Brett signs up for a new bank account, Brett's asked to take a selfie of himself, right, to present to the bank in order to prove this is who he claims to be. And so that obviously potentially has challenges. Widely known in the biometrics world, the idea of presenting a fake Brett or a photograph or something to pretend to be something other or someone other than who I intend to be or who I claim to be. And that process is pretty well known in the biometric world. There are well-known standards, there are testing protocols, there are mechanisms to resolve those kinds of challenges. And we talk a bit about those challenges in the paper, the ways to mitigate those risks, the kinds of testing, the kinds of standards you should be thinking about. There's another challenge too, though, which is that often that's compared against an image of someone's document, like a passport or a driver's license or something like that. And the validity of that document and of the photograph that you're trying to compare against, that's another critical issue. And we talk quite extensively about the challenges in that part of the process and making sure that you're really verifying correct data against correct data. You're not being fooled, if you like, by some duplicitous person trying to create an account that they shouldn't be able to create. So that issue of trust is a critical one. Thinking about outside of the process of binding, there are other intersections too with between biometrics and creation of digital identities. Deduplication is a process that biometrics are often used for, so trying to be certain that you've not got the same person signing up for multiple accounts. And we talk a bit about that in our onboarding paper, the ways deduplication and biometrics intersect with that process. And the final one I'll call out is just the linkage with other mechanisms like authentication. Obviously, at some later point, you, the financial services institution, will want to verify the identity of the new person who's just signed up for an account. It's key to stitch that identity together through the signing up process to make sure that you've got this continuity of identity throughout the process. So the identity you're verifying is the one that you thought you were signing up. Probably worth, Isabelle, thinking a bit about trust here. I talked about trust there for a second. That's a key aspect of what we do at the Institute, isn't it?
Absolutely. And just listening to the complexity of what you've said, if I think about this question, you know, how do you explain all this to your mates at a barbecue with a beer in your hand? Building trust amongst the public is critical, but it's a real challenge, because how do you explain all this to the customer, the consumer out there? I mean, we have in our industry survey a question about transparency, where I think it was 68% of the respondents said that it's absolutely important, but sadly there's a lack of transparency about how biometrics are being used. So we've got this conundrum somehow. We should be transparent, but how do we explain it in a way that people understand it? Yeah, what is the answer to that? How do we do that, Brett?
Well, that's tricky, right? And we've got these challenges around language too that you called out there. I mean, we as an industry in biometrics are not particularly good at using the same word consistently with the way everybody else uses it in society to mean the same thing. And so it is a bit of a challenge. I think openness and honesty and transparency are key. And that's reflected in other best practice guidance that we produce. You know, if you think about, we produce a set of privacy guidelines, for instance, that talk quite explicitly about the kinds of things you should be telling your customers about the ways you use biometrics, the ways you use the technology, the ways you use their data, and importantly, the ways you're not using their data.
Absolutely. I guess regulation, if we could have the next slide, please. That's a big theme, obviously, that keeps coming up. And again, we ask that question, is legislation covering the use of biometrics strict enough in your country? And I didn't give the demographics of the survey respondents, but nevertheless, if you just go next, Peter, please. It's really interesting to see that there was almost a split. Half of the people saying it is strict enough, the other half saying it isn't. And then when we looked at a breakdown in regions, we could see that in Europe, there was a slightly higher percentage of people who felt the legislation is strict enough. So GDPR certainly must be doing something here. Next slide, please. We also asked them then a follow-on question, in which areas is it not strict enough? And it wasn't surprising. Obviously, there's a lot of talk and a lot of media around the use of biometrics in policing and law enforcement, and a fear around surveillance. Again, a lot of misunderstandings there, what biometrics actually do and what biometrics are and what aren't biometrics. Commercial uses, this is where the future is going. We're hearing more about the metaverse and what's going to happen there, than social media and political use. But interestingly enough, financial services, there were still 37% of people who thought legislation isn't strict enough. So, you know, it was just quite fascinating to see that in the survey, don't you think, Brett?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges here is the wide range of different uses to which biometrics is put, right? With a huge range of different possible stakeholders, with a huge range of different uses. I think to some extent, perhaps consumers just lump things together in the same tin, if you like, and say, oh, well, that was bad in that context, so it must be bad in this other context. And it possibly leads back to that point about being really clear and honest and open about the sorts of ways that you should engage with people to make sure they understand what is being done and why it's being done and what the benefits are to them. I think that benefit case is a critical thing to talk about and explain.
Yeah, and legislation, as we know, takes a long time. And as I said at the beginning, biometrics are fast moving. I mean, the developments, for example, in facial recognition that we've seen just within 12 months, the improvement in its performance was incredible. So, you know, with artificial intelligence coming in, there's a lot happening in this area. So I guess guidance is another area, and that's really, as Brett already alluded to, is an area where we are active. We can move quite fast. If I could have the next slide. The Biometrics Institute was established in 2001. This was pre 9/11. It was a vision of a group of people who thought, if we do biometrics, we have to promote the responsible and ethical use of biometrics and related technologies that respect our institute's ethical guidance as an independent and impartial international forum for biometric users and other interested parties. So, you know, who is this institute? Well, we are a global membership organization. So just to give you a feel how this good practice is being developed, it is not just a one stakeholder perspective of the world. If I can have the next slide, please. There's over 200 membership organizations, and we roughly split it into different stakeholder groups. There's a large proportion of government, 30 different countries. Really amazing, obviously, the support we are getting there, and you see some listed. We have other users, so that's also where some financial institutions sit. You can see there Caixa, MasterCard, NatWest, Rabo, a range of financial institutions that engage, but also aviation and other groups. And then we have the supplier community, academics, and also international observers like the United Nations. And they all really have come together to find solutions, how we get this right. Next slide, please. Brett mentioned the privacy guidelines, which we first launched in 2006, which included 16 principles, most recently updated in May this year. So we keep it a living document. We said, should this become a standard? Should we put it through ISO? It all takes too long. Biometrics move too fast. And this year we added, for example, 2 new principles to it: the need for communication, so you heard about transparency, and also the need for law enforcement to ensure ethical use. And that obviously addresses the challenge that we are seeing there amongst the public. Next slide. We then launched, and I always like to show this incredible framework, a one-page document. And I wanted to show you this because this is hundreds of years of experience of biometrics that have come together, but it tells you how much you need to think about when you think about biometrics. So I don't want to scare you off biometrics. It is a fantastic technology and it is the way forward, but you need to use some form of pathway to work through all these factors that may influence or constrain the biometric application. And I think that is our main message to this audience here. It is absolutely fabulous to use this technology. It has come a long way, but it has its challenges. So Brett, maybe just to give you the final word, we have about 5 seconds left on our 25 minutes, but we might be able to go a minute over. I'm sure Michael will forgive us. Is there anything else that you like to add for people to take away?
Look, the only thing I'd say is that I think one of the things that keeps popping up is that it's very easy for organizations to place a lot of trust in the organization or the company that supplies biometric technology to them in the course of making biometrics work, in the course of bringing biometrics to life. And of course, there is an awful lot of expertise in that supplier community, as evidenced by the many members that we've got from that community of the Institute and the things that they talk about at our sessions. Okay. But when things go awry, it's very rarely the supplier's name who's in the newspaper, right? It's always the organization. And in a sense, it's impossible to outsource embarrassment. And so I think that's what a lot of our members get, our user members, the people who are end users of biometric technologies from the Institute. They get that place that they can go to for guidance and engaging with other people to get the best out of what they are, the implementation, the work that they're doing in biometrics.
Oh. Well, fantastic, and great to have both of you present that. We've got quite a few questions.
Thank you.
Get your questions and comments in quickly now, or we won't have a chance. But if we could, we do have quite a few, so we'll have to move swiftly. I'll start with 2 from Bob McDowell. Bob typed in fairly early on, how do biometrics address the processes of aging, for example, voice and appearance? And then how should biometrics address the destruction of details on death?
You want me to take that, Isabelle?
Yes, if you'd like.
It's probably fair to say that you would consult a wide range of stakeholders inside the Institute to get finished answers to all of your questions. But some starting points. Many of the technology suppliers who provide biometric technologies have thought through the challenges around aging and the natural course, if you like, of business. We all age at the same rate. It's 1 year per year, older we get, ultimately. And certainly in the field that I know best, from a technical mode perspective in voice, that's been thought through with some level of care. But there are points at which biometrics change in the life as well. Voice notably has a change through adolescence, of course. And so there's a fair bit of research in some contexts about how to navigate through those places. That intersects with another point, though, which is, of course, the use of biometrics in children, which is another controversial subject and one that needs quite considerable care. I know that one of the conversations that's happened inside the Institute has been from parties like registrars. You think about people like registrars of births, deaths, and marriages, and so on. Thinking about, well, do we want to capture biometrics at birth, or is that not an ethical thing to do? And those are live debates. People thinking about these subjects and what they should do with them. And when you start thinking about that from right back at start of life and using biometrics at that point, those issues of aging become even more important.
And Brett, isn't it really about aging that at some point you might have to re-enroll people? I guess that's, one of those answers.
Correct. And depending on technology and depending on the person's personal circumstances, sometimes there is discontinuous change. If you have radical surgery, thinking about voice, radical surgery to the throat, no amount of correction for aging is going to fix that issue. And designing those processes to handle that is key.
Graham Elliott is curious, have there been cases of fictional people being created complete with biometrics, or are these by definition impossible to detect?
Another live debate, I think it's probably fair to say, Isabelle. We were at a big conference each year, Congress, which you saw referenced in the results earlier. And one of the live subjects in biometric testing right now is about the creation of synthetic identities, whether that's by merging two identities, so creating some kind of morph of a pair of faces, let's say, so that both of them are able to fool the biometric system as though it were one. So imagine creating a passport that lets both me and Michael enter a nation. Or whether that's the creation of synthetic content to pretend to be somebody else, the famous reconstruction of Tom Cruise in digital form, for instance. So that's an absolutely live debate right now about what that means.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to compare biometrics, of course, with the other part of that, which is the human capacity for distinguishing some of those fakes. And these are also fascinating discussions that we have within the Institute membership.
Okay. Got an interesting question here from Susie Daly. What role can recognized international standards underpinned by accreditation and certification play in increasing trust and confidence in the use of biometrics? Sort of a biometric, CE mark or kite mark, as they say here in Britain.
Of course, there are a huge amount now of international standards, technical standards for biometrics and testing as well. So very well known is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, in the USA, who conduct a lot of performance related and now also the latest issue, demographic differentials, which is the issue of bias of the technology, and also masks is a new area that now is being looked at. So there's a lot happening. When it comes to governance standards, it all gets a little bit harder. It's an area where we've attempted some work around a trust mark potentially. How do you ensure that those issues around data protection, etc., are being followed? Obviously, here in Europe, as we said, we have GDPR, and there have been cases. There was a case earlier this year of a Spanish supermarket that actually got fined quite a high number of euros, and I've now forgotten the number, but because they put biometrics in place without actually going through the proper processes and were in breach of GDPR. So there are already things happening in that area.
Okay. We've got an interesting one as well here from Hugh Purser. Do you think you could see a public backlash against biometrics, face recognition misuse being a case in point, or is the government and commercial momentum simply too great?
Look, I think that is a real challenge, and I think it's fascinating. I've been with the Biometrics Institute a long time, for 19 years. When I started my role at the Institute, I didn't even know what biometrics were. Now, 19 years later, everyone seems to know something about biometrics. And as Brett said earlier, with that comes a problem. And that is that people think they know what biometrics are when it actually isn't. Now, that's not an excuse. We said in our mission, it is for us also about explaining related technology. but there's a lot of confusion around when biometrics do certain things. The difference between identification and verification has very different risks attached, but the people in the public, and you can't blame them, do not understand that. And why should they really have to understand that? So I think this is a big challenge. We have seen that in our industry over the last 2 years. There's a lot of conversations happening. And we, as a group, as I said, we have these different stakeholders. We have regulators involved. We have privacy advocates involved. So it's really important, and we welcome that these concerns are raised and being addressed. We now need to really work on making people better understand and feel reassured where the real risks lie around biometrics. Brett, did you want to add?
Just to add to that. I mean, a literal answer to the question is yes. Yes, you can imagine that world where that occurs, and it's probably fair to say that there's a live debate amongst some of the members of the Institute about would the world be a better place if we regulated more tightly in order to constrain the uses of biometrics to minimise the likelihood of that happening. And that was, I guess, the subtext of the poll that Isabelle showed you from interested biometric stakeholders. There are a body of people who think we should regulate this whole sector more tightly in order to minimise the risk of that occurring.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that our audience is almost spot on the average that you've had. We were running here at 56%, and I think you had 57 or something. Brett, you said something interesting. At one point, you mentioned about ways you're not using the data. Do you just want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of users of biometrics. This is probably a bit unfair, the phrasing I was going to say. There have been users of biometrics who've allowed data to be used for other things. So let me give a trivial example of that. We might say to our users, we're going to use biometrics to verify your identity when you contact us, to authenticate you. It's a small slope from there to then say, oh, maybe I can use it to minimize fraud by checking whether you've enrolled for our services multiple times. Did you tell the user you were going to do that? No. Should you have told the user you were going to do that? Well, possibly you can mount a case that you should have. And these sorts of challenges keep arising. A really public example of this is the scraping of information by a company, Clearview AI. They've made the news in biometric circles, and in fact even the broader mainstream media to some extent, by their scraping of public information about people's images and then using it in order to effectively do an image search. Someone's looking for someone who looks like me, go and appeal to some centralized search engine and find who that is. Those lead to really vexing questions, and there's some interesting stuff going on from a regulatory perspective, and privacy regulators thinking about these challenges right now.
Okay, we're coming short on time, so I've got a couple of big ones, but very quickly, Martin Hickley would like to know, can you expand at all on developments on the trouble with biometrics for those of different ethnic backgrounds?
Yeah, as I mentioned, and Brett, you can elaborate a bit more, but the so-called bias demographic differentials is a challenge that I think the wonderful thing about the biometrics community is they're always up for the next challenge, and they like to take that on, and they act actually relatively quickly. They've even developed standards already around that and testing. So it is a challenge. And coming back to the 3 laws, on the technology law, the 3rd law, what sits behind that in more detail is know your algorithm and know your data. So that's kind of the answer to that question. You have to go through rigorous testing of your particular audience, your demographic, to ensure that biometrics work. And you need to keep in mind that biometrics are a probabilistic technology. So just because you get a result at the end might not necessarily mean there's still a risk that it could be an incorrect result. Brett, very quickly, do you want to add any more to that?
Well, only to just make the analogy with people. If I only ever see people of a certain, ethnicity my entire life, I'll be pretty good at distinguishing people of that ethnicity apart. But then when anyone else, arrives to be distinguished apart, I'm going to have no idea. I'm not going to be able to distinguish those people. And that's that data point that you make, Isabelle, that the machines are only as good as the data that's fed into them. And that's one of the challenges in biometric technology, as it is across all of AI, right?
Alex Powell is curious, and given what you just said, I know there can be a rich answer, but just a quick one perhaps, if you don't mind. Which biometric signifier is the hardest to fake? Facial, thumbprint, what do you think?
Oh. Do we want to answer that?
Yeah, I must confess, I'd probably have to go back to the NIST testing where they test pretty thoroughly what each of them do. I will say that there is a bit of a movement in the industry towards multimodal biometrics. So thinking about maybe if we look at multiple different attributes of a person at the same time, we can do a better job than any one single one. That's how we do it as people, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has always bothered me is that every time we try and defend in some way entry to a system or access, what we actually do at the same time, of course, is to encourage ways of faking it. And in the case of biometrics, we've long seen the kind of the film element where somebody has their finger chopped off so we can use it to gain door access or something. You know, great stuff for Bond films. But if this does become quite used, then one would expect to see people developing very sophisticated systems to scam voices and fingerprints and faces, etc. Edwina Morton says, you know, what biometrics are safest to use? So if we go down this route, you know, do we deliberately want to choose a biometric that might be not the most secure, but might be the safest to use? She points out that fingerprints are used for many iPhones, but we've just seen the news how a young man had his drink spiked. Scammers used his fingerprint on his phone and managed to access all his bank and credit accounts, stealing some 18,000 pounds before he woke up. Retina scans can be scammed. You know, do I really want to have a retina scan as something that people are really trying to get hold of? Presumably voices too. The scammers are always ahead always. So how can individuals protect themselves in such circumstances when companies rely increasingly on this information? And I would add, our companies in fact attracting people into dangerous areas by using particular types of biometrics.
It's one of that challenge more generally, you know, people literally hacking things off people in order to attack a biometric. It's certainly a subject that's been debated and discussed within the Institute and the Institute's membership, and thinking about issues like what we call in our industry liveness. Can you make sure that when a biometric is presented, it's part of the actual human in question, that it's still a live human, it's not some artificial artifact, or indeed it's been detached from the rest of the body. Some biometrics, of course, lend themselves to that better than others, but it's absolutely a live debate. And it's one of the things that leads in the good practice framework that Isabelle waved on screen in front of you, to talk about selection of biometrics as a critical aspect, because that does vary use case by use case. You know, if you're trying to verify in certain contexts, some biometrics are good. In other contexts, they're absolutely hopeless. And so you do need to think that through very carefully, and it's not a decision to take lightly. I'd absolutely agree with that.
And it's not as simple. It's again the complexity that you hinted at, Brett. It's not that simple, and it is very much linked to risk. You know, because there's an investment as well behind it, and depending on what risk you have or what you're trying to protect, you will invest more, and that will determine your choice. And like you said, Brett, especially a consideration of multimodal, for example, because a biometric isn't perfect. If there was a perfect technology, I think we all would love to use it, but I think we haven't found it.
Okay. All right. Well, my colleague Ian Harris reminds us of Melvin Kranzberg. Melvin Kranzberg lived from 1917 to 1995, was an American historian and professor of history at Case Western. And he had 6 laws of technology. And the very first one was, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And Ian, and I think a number of the commentators here that I can see have on their mind the biggest issue is really about government's possible uses or abuses. But in the 60 seconds we have remaining, I'd like you to perhaps address Bob McDowell again. And I wonder, do you, in your institute, this is Bob's question, do you have guidance for disembarking, or are you on board for life?
Yes. Brett, I think you were going to come to that earlier question about the destruction as well of the biometrics, the details at death. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, perhaps to close it up, we've got 60 seconds left. It's a very important issue, and it's important not just for the person, of course, you know, what transpires there, but for the security of the ultimate system, right? You don't want to have dead people's biometrics lying around. They're all ultimately a risk to the security of the service. And so, insofar as planning and thinking carefully about the life cycle of a biometric system, it should know all about the life cycles of the people involved as well. And so if someone leaves your service for whatever reason, whether it's death or they choose to stop using your services, thinking through those end of relationship issues, whatever that end of relationship is, they're absolutely critical elements in the execution of the system. All too often these things aren't thought through, and people execute technology systems and don't think about the wider context. It is very, very important, most important to biometrics to do so.
Great.
As we've just seen, right, in Afghanistan, for example.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Retention of data.
Well, we've run to time, sadly, and we need to let Brett get back to bed, I think.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
If I could, is 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, as ever, to our sponsors. I know this is very much up everybody's street, but it is kind that they do let us wander around a number of interesting topics, and I think we'll be coming back to biometrics repeatedly over the years to come. Secondly, if I could thank the audience, some really good insights, Kranzberg's law, guidance after death, and the danger of these biometrics being, directing really the way in which the scammers might become much more physical. Anyway, some really good comments there. Looking ahead, we have a fascinating session tomorrow. Claire Moran, possibly one of the brightest physicists in Cambridge. She's going to be chatting to us about new physics, new technologies, and new perspectives, searching for the missing 96% of the universe. I think you'll find it fascinating. But most of all, my thanks to Brett and Isabelle. It's been a real delight to have you. It's good that you've managed to whiz this across both hemispheres, but you've been wonderful and charming and have been very open about the various questions that your areas of interest do raise. Unfortunately, I have no biometrics that allow me to open things for the audience, but I do have here my Korean karmic clapper, and that one I'm afraid I have to do by way of thanks. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and the things that you're researching today with us. And I was delighted to see that our audience is very much in a similar zone to you.
Thank you, Michael. Absolute pleasure to share our insights with your audience. Thank you.
And thank you from the other side of the world, as you point out.